Hello friends, welcome back to my channel, and today we are back with another exciting video. And in this video we're going to talk about monolith and microservices. So if you're very new to what is monolith application and what is microservices, don't worry, in this video we'll be talking about complete details on what is monolith, what is microservices application, and what are their benefits, in which scenarios you can go for monolith application, which scenarios you can go for microservices. And in our case, we have a lot of tutorials on Docker, Kubernetes, where we spoke about a lot of applications, and microservices is a best scenario, like how you can deploy a lot of your application using containerized concept. So in this tutorial, what we will see is we'll talk about how you can describe about a monolith application and how you can move that into a microservices using a practical example of an application, which we will consider like this application, and what are the components for it, and what will be the use case, and how it can be converted into a microservices if you want to change them. So that will be the overall agenda of this tutorial, so you can get a complete information on what is monolith application, what is microservices, what are the benefit, disadvantages, and all those things we will talk about in this tutorial. So before I'm getting started into the main topic, I would request you, like, if you are new to my channel or if you have not subscribed to my channel, click on the subscribe button. Also like my videos, share with others, and also give your comments in the comment section about the videos and what you want to see more. So let's get started with the monolith architecture. So in order to understand the whole concept, let's imagine an application, because we need to take a practical example. So for this tutorial, let's take an example like you have a e-commerce Java based application, and like usually our Java based application will be running on Tomcat or some other web browser, right? Web server. So in our case, we will consider it as a Tomcat web server, and you are running your Java based application. So since it's a e-commerce application, you may have your web application have a different interfaces, right? Like you need to have a user registration page where you can register to your web e-commerce page. For example, your Amazon or some application, eBay or something, you need to have a user registration, right? And you also need to have a login page where user can log into your application. And you also will have a product catalog, right, where you'll be able to see all the products available in the application. And also you will have different kind of supports like chat, emails, IM. So different kind of support options will be there. You'll have order page, right, where you can once you added your product, you can order them. And you will have recommendation also coming, like in your application, right? You'll have a lot of recommendations coming based on the usage, so that also you will have it in your application. So there are different these are some features I'm mentioning, so it's just a example I'm trying to give you so that you can relate it to that with a practical scenario. But in your case, you can have different n number of features. It depends upon your application. And let's consider that this application is running on a Tomcat server, or as a service. And also your application will have a database, right? Usually the database will be having the whole content of your application stored, so that the application get the needed information from the database. So in this scenario, if you see, all the functionalities of your application or the project is put into a single code base, right? So you're building a whole application which will have all these features embedded in it, and that will be put into a single code. So in that case, now you should understand what is a monolith application. So a monolith architecture is considered to be a traditional way of building application. So traditional doesn't mean like we are not using anymore. We are still using monolith application, and that is a standard way of doing for small applications and different scenarios based on your need. But it's considered as a traditional way, but a lot of new applications like Facebook, a lot of new applications, they are into the microservices. Now, as I mentioned, the whole monolith application is built as a single and indivisible unit. So that means your whole code is having the whole application and it's a single code. So if the whole application which we mentioned about e-commerce, there are different features, but the whole features into a single code. So there may be multiple developers who has worked on it, but it's a whole single code and it's bundled into a single maybe jar or a var or some kind of file after compiling, and once you run it, you will have the whole applications running. So basically in normal monolith, what we will have it comprises of a client side user interface where user can access your application like your mobile or a desktop application, or it's a web browser. And you also have server side application where you'll have Tomcat or IAS or some kind of web server which is running this application, and also you'll have a database where the whole data will be stored. So that's the simple basic structure of a monolith application, and I think most of your normal application will be running in that concept. And as I again mentioned, like monolithic application have one large code base and it's lack modularity. So even though we spoke about a lot of features, all these features are bundled into a single large code base, and it does not have split like this separate modular functionalities. So if the developer want to update or change something on this monolithic application, they have to make the changes in the whole stack. So whenever they want to make a change, they have to change the whole application itself. So the application has to be down, and then they have to update it. So that's the main challenge for a monolithic application. So developer has to completely take the whole code base and they have to update it. So maybe the part of the update may be a small part, but the whole code base has to be merged together for that. Now, what are the advantages of using a monolith? So the basic advantage of monolithic is like it's simple to develop. So since it's a concept is straightforward, you take whole features, you develop it, and you put into a whole code, right? So it's simple to develop. So it's like more like you will have waterfall models, agile methods, right? So if you see waterfall, it's a whole requirement is collected, you just create the whole application, but it may take long time, but its development process will be same. But whereas iteration model, you have to keep splitting and you'll have to have a lot of changes, very frequent. So in monolith, it's a simple process of development because it's a straightforward process. And since it's a monolithic, the testing and debugging is pretty easier because they know the complete straightforward application, because it's a single code and it's the end-to-end process, because there are no multiple chain of connection from one one service from here to there and there to there. A lot of crisscross is not happening here. So it's like a simple single code, so it's easier for debugging and testing. And also, as I mentioned, the more of this application is a single code. Once you compile it, you will get a single jar file or var file, so it's easier to deploy. So the deployment process of your monolith application is also easier compared to microservices. So now let's go to some of the disadvantages of using monolith. So with the time, so as I mentioned, it's a single code. So as the time passes, you may keep updating your code, adding new features. So the system of the system become more complex, and the code of this application also become too large. And in that case, it becomes too hard to manage also, because the code keep increasing and it's very hard to manage the whole application. And if some changes has to be done, you need to look into the whole bigger code. So that's one of the disadvantage of monolith. So that's one case. And the scalability. So this is the main reason for a lot of you people has gone for monolith to microservices, which we'll talk later point. So scalability is a big challenge, because you cannot scale components independently. The only way is like you need to scale the whole application. For example, you are having your e-commerce application running on a web browser, and the usage of product catalog and ordering may be less, but the search function, maybe they are keep searching for more products, and that may be putting a lot of more load on the server. So you cannot scale the search part alone. So if you want to scale, you need to scale the whole server itself. So what you will have to do is you have to add more servers and you have to manage it, the application on that. So that's a big challenge on the scalability part, so that we will see how this can be corrected as part of microservice architecture. So, and another disadvantage of monolith is like adoption of new technologies. Since this is a huge bunch of or large code base, if you want to adapt, like currently you may be using with some of old technology or coding programming, and if you want to change that to a new coding programming, it's a huge of work, and you need to convert the whole code into that, and you need to make your application running. It's a huge problem, and adopting to the new technology is a bigger problem in the case of monolith. And other disadvantages, like a single bug in any module can bring the whole application itself down. So as we discussed about, like there are different features, like you have user interface, you have ordering page, you have a lot of other issues, features. So in the case of there is a problem in the ordering, the whole application is down, because if you want to make some fixes in the ordering, you cannot do it that part alone. It's a whole single code, so you need to bring the whole application down. Whereas if there is a way, like your application can still log in, can still search for product, but the only problem is in the ordering part, you can fix that separately. That will be much better, right? So that's the things which we will see it in microservices, how this monolith these problems, like when there is a problem with application, you need to bring the whole application itself as down. And the same thing, like adding new features or improving existing features is also a tedious task, because it requires the whole application has to be updated and check the whole compatibility, whole integration has to be working correctly, and it requires the whole application has to be restarted or updated, because you cannot just update that small module or part alone based on the feature request. So that's the biggest disadvantages of monolith application. Now let's see how we can define a microservice. So defining microservice, let's consider all the aspects. So we have considered whatever we discussed as part of monolith, and we considered all the aspects, and the team has decided, like they will break down this application into separate microservices. So now we know, like the lot of features we have, it lot of microservices we can create from that. So what we will do is, like as part of defining microservice of our e-commerce application, what we are planning is, like we will do a user interface, which is a single page application, so the users can connect or log in with that. And from the user interface, we will have all the connection using API gateways, and these API gateways will connect to the microservices. So we'll talk about more about what all the components we can create in the microservices, and each microservices we will have a separate database also, so that it can separately store the data content related to those microservices or features. So that's how we are going to define our microservice. Now let's talk about this architecture, microservice architecture. We've seen the monolith architecture of our e-commerce application. Now let's see how we can convert that into a microservice architecture. So as I said, the front end would be a user interface page. You can create it with any kind of technologies for a single page application, and that will connect to the API gateways, and API gateways will connect to the different microservices. So the microservice, in our case, what we will do is we will separate the user registration as a one-off microservice. So it will have its own microservice for user registration page, and also it will have its own database. So when user click on that page, it will take it to separate a microservice. So it's not like a single bundle of code as it's part of my monolith. And also we will separate the user login as a separate microservice, where it'll have its own database, and also it can have a different microservice for product catalog. It can have it for separate for order page, and you can add more microservices based on what, since because of the space constraint, I have not added the other microservices like the supports, or the recommendation. You can also add other microservices based on the features which you want to bring. So these all can run as a separate component or independently, and these all can interact each other based on the requirement. So what we have done is we have divided the application into separate microservices based on the functionality. So what are the functionalities which you need to convert as a microservice, and the usage of API gateway. So we are using API gateway to connect all these microservices to the single page applications. So that's the microservice architecture we are discussing about as part of this tutorial. Now what we did is each functionality is implemented as a microservice. So that is the place when you're defining on your application. Now you may have a monolith application. You need to decide which functionalities has to be separated as a microservice. And each microservice you can think about like it doesn't need a database or it does not need. So based on that requirement, you can have a separate database for each microservice so it can interact with that database for the content. And also you can create a web interface designed with single page application. So that will be our front edge for user interface, and you also introducing API gateway. So this will be to provide external facing communication, some security and standard features as well. So usually you can use HTTP or lightweight communication for that. So that's how we are going to what we discussed as part of the previous architecture, what we wanted to do our monolith to microservice concept. Now what is a microservice? So now you understood what is a microservice. So in order to tell you in a statement or definition, microservices are small services that work together. So that's the basic as the name itself says, microservices. So they are the smaller part of small services which will work together. That's the microservice. So in our case of web development or in our application, so it's an architectural development style. So we have a monolith application, right? So we are going to convert that into a microservice application. So we are going to change our style of our application, and it's made up of smaller services. So your application will be split into smaller services which will communicate with each other directly. So that's the basic statement for microservice. And microservice architecture has a significant impact on relationship between the application and database, because each previously in monolith what we have seen is you'll have a single database with all the content. So in microservices you usually will have a separate database for each microservices. So each microservices has its own database and they can interact with that, and each service covers its own scope. So in microservice, each service is independent and it's have its own scope, and it can be updated separately, it can be deployed separately, it can be scaled independently. So that's the benefit of microservice, because the part of microservice, for example, we considered our user registration page or concept as a microservice. So that will act as a separate scope or independent, so that if you want to make any changes in that user registration page later point, you can update that alone separately, you can deploy that alone separately, you can scale. Like if you see like there is a lot of load on that user registration page, so you can add more servers into that server alone which run those microservices. So that's the big benefit of using microservice. So let's talk about the advantages of microservice. So as I mentioned, better scalability. So each element can be scaled independently. So as I just told you before, if you have more load on a single microservice, you don't have to scale the whole application. You can scale only to that each component which is having overloaded. So that's the benefit of microservice. You can have better scalability of your application, and you can effectively utilize your resources. And the components are independent. So the each components which we are creating or microservices are independent. So all these services can be deployed, updated, or some issues there, you can fix that specifically for that component alone, and which gives you more flexibility. So you don't have to bring the whole application down, or if you want to update more frequently, you can update that component alone. And other benefit is like it's easier to understand, because as we mentioned about monolith, the code becomes so huge, it will become so complex as well, and it's very hard to manage. Whereas in microservices, if the resource or developer is having good skill on microservices skill, it's easy for them to understand, because each applications are independent, and the applications the microservice part is easy to understand and manage. So that's also benefit of microservice. But one challenge here it is like this: associate or people who working on microservice should be competent on to work on microservice concept. And the higher level of agility. So as I mentioned, each components are separate and they don't have impact on other applications. So it's as part of agile methods, you can have more changes into that application. You can create more frequent updates. You can implement more changes with lower risk and fewer errors. So that's also a big benefit of microservice. That's why like Facebooks, you may see like they will have different microservice. For example, the Facebook page will have one, the feeds will have another microservice, groups may be a different microservice, so that if they want to make any changes on one part, they don't have to bring the whole application down. They will do the changes very frequently on that part alone. And less downtime. So as I mentioned, it's particularly like microservice go down due to some bugs or anything. It does not affect the whole microservice, so whole application. And so what it does means, like as I mentioned, if you only have issues with the registration page or login page, you just fix that alone. You don't have to bring the whole application down. So the users can still access the application on all other parts. So you just fix the simple single microservice component alone. So what are the disadvantages of microservice? So again, here also the case is the complexity increases with the number of microservices, because there will be a lot of communication chains happening from one component to other components. So you need to understand this flow of communication happening, and that complexity will increase as part of increasing the number of microservices. And also you need to have skilled developers, because microservice, those who have worked on monolith, they know basic straightforward coding and creating those application. But microservice, you need to have skilled developers who know about microservice concept and how you can have segregate individual components of your application or services for each part. And the other big challenge is microservice is it's harder for testing, because the microservice is a new technologies and you're having separate component deployed, and it's hard to understand the whole flow for testers sometimes. So since it's independently deployable components, it's harder for them to test this application as a whole together as well. And deploying these microservices is also more complex if it's become more increasing numbers. So it's not like a simple direct forward, you have a war file with compile one, you just go and put into a web server or Tomcat or something, and you can run it. So the microservice, you may use a lot of other Kubernetes or Docker containers. So a lot of things you may be running different components, so you need to have a better understanding of how the microservice applications are deployed, and you should be able to deploy it. So one thing which I also want to talk is like when you need to go for monolith and when you need to go for microservice. So if your application is simple, straightforward, and if you're a new small group of people or small company, you can directly go for monolith, and you don't have a skilled resource for microservice, you can directly go for monolith application, and there is no problem in having monolith applications. You're always welcome to decide which kind of application you need to go, whether monolith or microservices. Based on your requirement, you can go even complex application. If you want to go for monolith, you can go for it. But whereas in your case, you see that your application is too complex and you need to have a scalable application and better utilization of resource, you can definitely go for microservices, but you need to have a very skilled resources for that, and you should be able to go for microservices as well. So in our case, we are done with the discussion of monolith and microservices. So I would request you, like if you want to watch more videos and if you want to like my videos, I would request you like to subscribe my channel for more videos, and also give my videos a thumbs up if you like it, and also share your feedback in the comment section so that I can take those and correct it. I can also look for your feedback. If you want to watch more videos on these kind of technologies, or what you want to see, you can put it in the comment section. So thank you for watching.